Hello and welcome to another episode of Expert Speak. Today, our topic of discussion is on China India relations. As you are all aware, China India relations is one of the most important bilateral relations in the 21st century, and the nature of this relationship will, to a great extent, shape the geopolitics of Asia as well as the world. Um, Our guest today is Dr. Pradeep Taneja. He is Deputy Assistant Associate Dean and Senior Lecturer in Asian Politics in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne. He is also an academic fellow of the Australia India Institute and a member of the Center for Contemporary Chinese Studies. His research interests focus on the rise of India and China as significant powers, Australia India relations, Sino India and Sino Australian relations, and the Indian Ocean security. He has published books and monographs on these subjects and is a regular commentator on global and regional issues. Welcome, Dr. Taneja. Uh,
Thank you, Yhome.
yeah, let me start our conversation with an assertion. Uh, it is said that there are three C's that are inherent in the relationship between two big neighbors. Here, the three C's stand for cooperation, competition, and conflict. Now, we have seen all this in India-China relations. In recent years, we have seen the element of competition, uh, becoming more sharper in the relationship. And in that sort of an environment, the propensity for conflict over cooperation is higher. Now, how do you see the state of India-China relations today in terms of how they are managing their competition to minimize conflict and maximize cooperation?
Thank you. It's a good question. Uh, with us between India and China, we saw a major conflict in 1962, even though the relationship between India and the People's Republic of China started off very well, with India becoming one of the first countries to recognize the PRC. But by 1962, of course, the relationship had deteriorated so that we had the war in 1962 until the resumption of the ambassadorial level relations in 1976. There was a chill between China and India. But since China began to open up its economy in the late 1970s, China adopted a foreign policy of engaging with all countries. And we saw India and China begin to negotiate on the disputed border, and economic relationship, cultural relationship, people-to-people relationship, all developed to a significant degree between these two countries. So much so that by the time Prime Minister Modi came to power in India in 2014, and President Xi Jinping, who became the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party in 2012, and later on President in 2013, we saw the relationship between these two countries improve quite significantly. We saw Prime Minister Modi visit China, President Xi Jinping came to India, and the imagery of these two leaders, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, sitting on a swing, on a jhula, on the banks of the Sabarmati River, projected an image of two countries, two Asian giants, really getting along very well together. But by 2020, we saw relationship had deteriorated. We, of course, for the first time in 45 years, in 2020, along the border between these two countries, we saw casualties, we saw fatalities when 20 Indian soldiers were killed And according to the Chinese, 4 Chinese soldiers were killed, but the Indian side maintains that the number of Chinese fatalities may have been higher. So since then, since June 2020, the relationship between China and India has kind of stagnated, although there is still dialogue. The fact that the foreign ministers of China and India have met twice this month. In July 2024, the foreign ministers of the two countries have met twice. That's a good indication. That's an indication that at least the dialogue between India and China is continuing. We've had multiple rounds of negotiations between the military and the diplomatic officials from both sides, in the mechanism for dealing with the border problem. We've also seen meetings between the foreign ministers of the two countries. So I think that's a good sign that they're still able to talk. But at the same time, clearly there is the situation on the border is not very normal. So if we go back to your 3 C's, cooperation, the level of cooperation between China and India at the moment is not very high. We don't even have direct flights between the two countries at the moment. The Chinese side wants to resume direct flights, but the Indian government has maintained that they cannot be business as usual until the situation on the border is not normal. So we used to have nearly 20,000 Indian students studying in China. That number has dropped quite significantly, and people-to-people connection between the two countries have really declined. So when it comes to cooperation, on many fronts, we've seen a decline in contact between these two countries. But on the other hand, when it comes to economic cooperation, trade cooperation, we have seen trade has continued to grow. The trade between India and China, in fact, is the only bright star, because when it comes to bilateral trade, India continues to import large quantities of electronic goods and other parts which are needed for India's own manufacturing industry. So despite the Indian government wanting to reduce dependence on China, we've not been able to do that because China has become a very important part of global supply chains. And if Indian companies need components and other electronic products which go into the manufacturing of further developed manufacturing products, we have not been able to reduce the dependence on China. Despite the government trying to reduce, we've not been able to reduce the dependence. In fact, the deficit between China and India, the trade deficit, continues to grow. So one could say that when it comes to cooperation on trade issues is growing. Indian government, for example, after the border incident in 2020, Indian government had tightened restrictions on issuing visas to Chinese business people, technicians coming to India. But it seems that those restrictions have now been relaxed because big Indian companies who are engaging with Chinese companies who are buying a lot of equipment, a lot of technology from China, they need Chinese technicians to come and install. So give you one example. India is building multiple new ports, and Chinese companies are the biggest suppliers of cranes, large cranes, which are used in ports. So a new port has just opened in Kerala, for example, and all the cranes for that port came from China. So if you import equipment like cranes from China, you have to give visas to Chinese technicians who have to come and install those cranes. So because of that, Indian government has relaxed the visa conditions, particularly for Chinese technicians and engineers. So on trade front, I think there is still cooperation, largely because China has become almost an indispensable partner for India when it comes to trade. But people-to-people connections are not growing as they were 5-6 years ago or before COVID. Cooperation in terms of academic cooperation, also we have seen a decline in academic cooperation. And certainly there hasn't been a meeting of the leaders of the two countries. We've seen the foreign ministers meet and we've seen officials meet, but the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, and Xi Jinping have not met for a long time now. And that is the level where real progress can be made. But we haven't seen the leader level, summit meetings between the two countries. So cooperation is happening in some areas, particularly in trade, but competition seems to be the defining feature. Conflict, fortunately, which took place in 2020 has not been repeated. The situation on the border remains tense. There is still large deployment of troops on both sides, particularly in eastern Ladakh. That hasn't changed. But fortunately, there hasn't been renewed conflict. Competition is growing. India, of course, is a member of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. India's security relationships with the United States, Australia, Japan, and other partners have continued to grow. And that is a signal of competition between China and India. So of the three C's that you mentioned, I think trade is the brightest star. But in other areas, there is competition. And at the moment, there is no conflict as such, but certainly there's a potential for conflict.
Right, right. Yeah, you mentioned the Quad. Now, if you look at India-China relations in the context of the emerging world order, now, both India and China are today key players in shaping the emerging security economic architectures. Uh, how do you see the role of India-China in shaping the emerging, regional global order, and how these processes in turn sort of shape their bilateral relations?
Uh, Cooperation in shaping the regional security architecture, for example, requires two powers, and India and China are the two largest countries in Asia. In terms of population, now India has overtaken China as the world's most populous country, but China remains the second most populous country. India's economy is also growing. In fact, it is the fastest growing major economy. China's economy has slowed, but China is the world's second largest economy. And India is aiming to be the world's third largest economy. So these two countries are very important players on the international stage. But for these two countries to be able to shape the regional security architecture, I think it is essential that first of all, they can find some common understanding on differences that divide them. And we know that on the border issue, which is the biggest issue dividing these two countries, we have seen things deteriorate over the last 4 years rather than improve. So personally, I'm not very optimistic that India and China can shape the regional security architecture, because the precondition of being able to do that is that they should be able to have a level of comfort at the bilateral level. And as I mentioned earlier, the leaders of these two countries have not met since the conflict, in 2020, and therefore the level of comfort, level of trust is low. And because of that, I think China and India are not really ideal partners when it comes to really creating a new security architecture in the region. If anything, the security architecture that exists in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, India has tilted more towards partners such as Japan, Australia, and the United States, much to China's chagrin. China is not very happy about it. So this region doesn't have the kind of security architecture that exists, for example, across the Atlantic, with the NATO security treaty. This region doesn't have a comprehensive regional security architecture. Whatever security architecture exists in this region is largely centered around ASEAN-related, organizations. So we have the ASEAN Regional Forum, we have the East Asia Summit, we have the defense ministers meeting. So much of the architecture that exists in the region is largely centered on ASEAN, but that architecture is weak. it is not, at least at the moment, it is not in a position to actually resolve major differences amongst countries. ASEAN, for example, has not even been able to solve the problem in Myanmar, let alone solve bigger problems in the world. So whatever the architecture does exist, it is bilateral and increasingly trilateral. We have seen a new trend where minilaterals or trilaterals have become very commonplace. So,
Yeah.
including India, many countries are setting up these minilaterals. They're playing a much more significant part in advancing mutual understanding, particularly among security partners. China, India, Russia also have a trilateral, but at the moment that is not doing too well either.
Sure. Uh, Now coming to China and the Indian Ocean, as China's footprint grows in the Indian Ocean, there is this argument that China is trying to lock in India in the continental uh, border disputes, thereby allowing itself to expand its influence in the maritime domain in the Indian Ocean. How do you view, in your view, how valid is that argument?
Well, if you look at China's presence in the Indian Ocean, there is no doubt that Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean has been growing over the years. China has the fastest growing navy in the world. China is producing more naval ships and submarines than any other country. In fact, it is said that China adds to its navy equivalent of the French navy every 4 years. So China's naval capabilities are growing, and we have seen China's naval footprint grow with that, including in the Indian Ocean. So China's naval presence in the Indian Ocean is now a reality. And on the open seas, on the high seas, of course, China has China legally has the right to sail through the Indian Ocean. Much of China's trade also passes through the Indian Ocean. So China's growing naval footprint in the region is a reality, and it is a matter of concern for India. It is a matter of concern for India. But really, it will depend on what kind of player China is going to be in the Indian Ocean. If in the Indian Ocean, China is going to be a benign player, where China's primary interests are in safeguarding the sea lanes of communication for itself and for other countries, as the United States has done since the Second World War. So if China's intentions were benign, this would not be a problem. But we've seen China has built infrastructure in many countries in the Indian Ocean, including in India's neighborhood, from Sri Lanka, Hambantota to Gwadar port in Pakistan, Myanmar. China has been building a lot of new maritime infrastructure. And much of this infrastructure is dual use. It can be used for civilian purposes, it can be used for military purposes. We've seen Chinese ships, Chinese submarines, including Chinese spy ships, sail through these ports or make calls on these ports. So India's concerns about China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean are related to what China's intentions are, and China is quite an opaque sort of system where Chinese government doesn't really reveal much about its intentions. Much of what is published in terms of white papers, defense white papers, they hide as much as they reveal. So for India, it is important to ensure through dialogue, through communication with China, as to what China's intentions are in this part of the world. Now, you raised a very important question about the situation in the Himalayas along the border between China and India, whether China is increasing its military presence on the border, for example, in eastern Ladakh, to essentially distract India from developing or maintaining its strong presence in the Indian Ocean. And there is some truth to that, because historically, conflict between India and China has largely been along the land border. But there is no guarantee that the next time there is a conflict between China and India, that it would be confined to the land border alone. It's very likely that this could actually be both a land conflict and a maritime conflict. So clearly, China has been building capabilities on the border. I'm not suggesting that everything that China is doing on the border, for example, building infrastructure, military infrastructure on the border with India, is designed to simply use it as a leverage in the maritime domain. But certainly, I think there is a dimension of that, that pressure. That if China can mount pressure on the border, then India's resources are limited. Every country has limited resources. That although India's defense budget has been rising, but if India has to spend much more money on building infrastructure, deploying large number of troops along the border with China, then it will have less resources left to devote to naval development, to devote to the maritime development. So certainly, I think there is that dimension too.
Now, coming to South Asia, Delhi's prioritization of engagement with its smaller neighbors coincided with U.S.-China, rivalry intensifying in South Asia. If you look at Southeast Asia, we have seen as U.S.-China rivalry, sort of increase in that region, Delhi's strategic value increased for the region. Now, uh, as a sort of stabilizing force in that region. Now, South Asia seems to be presenting such a geopolitical situation for India today in the context of U.S.-China competition. Uh, what is your assessment about India's strategy in South Asia in the context of the intensifying rivalry between U.S.-China?
Okay. Now, I'm a strong supporter of Indian government's policy of neighborhood first. Prioritizing India's neighborhood. We saw, for example, recently, even in the latest Indian government budget, which was presented by the finance minister just a few days ago, that there are allocations for every neighboring country. In fact, for some of the neighboring countries, there are thousands of crores of rupees have been set aside for aid and assistance to India's neighboring countries. And I think that is a good strategy, because India needs to manage its neighborhood. Because if your neighborhood is unstable, or you leave room for other powers to play mischief in your neighborhood, then you would not be able to play a bigger role beyond your borders. And that's why it's important for India to make sure that it has good relations. It is a generous benefactor for its neighbors. All the countries, many of the smaller states in the region, they are dependent on foreign assistance. And India has emerged as one of the most significant, aid donors and the first responder when it comes to any natural disasters. So India is the first responder. Indian agencies, Indian military, Indian Navy are often there to assist India's neighbors. And that, I think, is a good policy. That's a very strategic decision made by the Indian government, that we need to make sure that India's neighborhood is India's priority. It is going to be difficult because China is also a big benefactor of these countries. China is also pumping a lot of money. And particularly, China is willing to build massive infrastructure projects in all the neighboring countries. So there is competition between China and India when it comes to South Asia, because China also has deeper pockets than India. And China has greater capacity to build infrastructure. And most of these countries need infrastructure. And therefore, they welcome initiatives by the Chinese government to create and to build new infrastructure projects. So there is always going to be some competition between China and India. But India has to make sure that India leverages its historical ties with its neighbors, its cultural ties with the neighbors, its economic ties with the neighbors, because India has been historically the biggest influence in these countries. And India should do it without being seen, without being perceived as a hegemonic, influence, as a hegemonic power. India should be seen as a country which is a big neighbor, but at the same time a neighbor which is always ready to extend help to these countries, to India's South Asian neighbors. China, of course, will continue to build its presence in the region, and China's assistance to these countries is not without self-interest, because China does want to make sure that it has strategic leverage in India's neighborhood, because China's long-term strategy has been to tie India down to South Asia, to limit India's ambitions and India's aspirations. To tie it down to South Asia so that India's energies are focused on dealing with its neighborhood rather than extending its influence beyond its neighborhood, so that the periphery is where India is essentially bogged down rather than being able to extend its influence. And I think that strategy of China has largely failed, because India has succeeded in gaining greater clout, greater influence in regions beyond India's immediate borders, and I think that is something that India should continue to do. You mentioned India's importance in geopolitics in the region. India is being seen as an indispensable partner by the likes of the United States. Historically, US and India have rarely been on the same side, but increasingly we are seeing United States sees India as an important partner. They in fact they even use the word ally. Many American officials frequently refer to India as an ally, at least as a partner. India is certainly a partner of the United States. And it would not be an exaggeration to say that China's aggressive behavior in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly in the maritime domain when it comes to South China Sea or the East China Sea, is a factor in the decisions of the United States or Japan or Australia to see India as an important strategic partner. So India's geopolitical importance certainly has grown. And it's grown largely because India is a democracy. India is one of the fastest growing major economies. India has a huge domestic market, but also because India has a disputed border with China. And China hasn't done anything to try to resolve that border problem. In fact, I think China may be interested in maintaining that border dispute. China may not have an interest in resolving the border dispute because it gives them leverage on this long border between China and India.
Right. Lastly, Dr. Taneja, China-India relations in the Northeast, the border conflict is now spilling over to water resources. According to media reports, China plans to build a dam, a 60,000 megawatt dam on the Brahmaputra River. This has triggered, of course, the concerns in India. Uh, how do you see India-China relations in the context of Northeast Asia?
See, if you look at Northeast is seen by the Indian government as an important part of the country, both in its own right, but also for India's Look East policy, or Act East policy, as Prime Minister Modi has renamed it. If India's Act East policy is to be successful, if India's engagement with countries to India's east is to bring benefits, both economic and strategic benefits to India, then Northeast region will obviously, inevitably, play an important part. What China is doing in Tibet, building dams on Brahmaputra, or Yalung Tsangpo as it is called in Tibet, is definitely going to have an impact on downstream, in India, and countries like Bangladesh and others will also be affected by it. So many of the rivers that flow into South Asia originate in Tibet, and Tibet is the source of significant, water, significant natural resource. And that's where I think if China and India were able to have a kind of comfort, the level of comfort, which we saw about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, India and China had a much better level of comfort with each other. There was dialogue, there was a greater trust between these two countries. And as a result, we also saw that China and India were able to share hydrological data. Hydrological data, for example, whether it is about rivers in India's north or in the northeast, um, a sharing of hydrological data, particularly about the water flows, about the Chinese reservoir and any new dams, etc., that they're building. If China and India are able to, on a routine basis, on a regular basis, able to share this kind of data, it will help in dealing with any difficulties, whether it's a supply of drinking water or dealing with floods. It would be easier to mitigate any problems. But at the moment, I think cooperation in many other areas has kind of stalled, and China has plans which are not being shared with the Indian government. China is not sharing enough data with the Indian government when it comes to water resources, etc. So water is a very important issue. In fact, water is such an important issue that some experts warn that future wars may be fought over water. So water is a very important issue. It's important for the survival of the people in the region, and strategically, it's a very important resource. But again, water is also affected by the overall relationship between China and India. When the relationship is good, when the level of trust between these two countries is high, we will see greater cooperation in all areas, including when it comes to sharing hydrological data. But at the moment, relationship is not good. At the moment, relationship, as the Indian Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar keeps saying, the relationship is not normal. And it's not normal largely because the 2 points on the border in eastern Ladakh, where China still has a very strong military presence, and where China has still not withdrawn from the areas that it controls. It has come to occupy. So until that happens, I can't see how this relationship will return to normal. Um, Trade will continue, economic relationship will continue. Maybe even direct flights may resume between China and India, because Indian traders also want to be able to travel to China. So there is a mutual advantage in resuming direct flights. But until there is trust and there is a level of comfort between the leaders of the two countries, I can't see how the things will return to normal, including water situation or cooperation that affects the people of the Northeast.
Sure. Dr. Taneja, thank you for your time and for your insights. And
Thank
we
you,
look
Dr. Yhome.